Okay, I've got the signal for us to go. My name is Anjali Arundekar, and I want to welcome you to our second event of our series on futures. I am the co-director of the Center for South Asian Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. We have been privileged to host many wonderful events this year. Our first event was on Sri Lanka and the people protest. And for those of you who were unable to attend, we've had lots of emails asking for recordings of the event. The recording is up on our website as well as up on our YouTube channel, and please feel free to avail of it. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge, as is needed, that the land on which UCSC stands is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking UP tribe. The Amamatsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous peoples, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Now, having made that statement, I also want to reiterate that it is worth remembering, as many indigenous scholars have repeatedly reminded us, that an acknowledgement of land is not the same as a relationship. Land does not require that you confirm it exists or that it has been stolen, rather that you reciprocate the care it has given you. Now, the Center for South Asia Studies, which is a very new center, we came of age during the pandemic and learned of the possibilities and perils of gathering together across oceans and time zones at that time. So the center is unusual in that it is focused on the exploration of social and economic justice across South Asia and the Indian Ocean world. Now, in many ways, such a focus on justice may seem for many of you presentist, given the rapid rise and circulation of cultures and regimes of authoritarianism, communalism, and hatred. But as we know, such issues persist and have robust historical and geographical genealogies. Our hope has been and continues to be that our center, as I said, would become a place of gathering, a conversation and debate for histories of subalternity in all their multiple iterations. And all our speakers join us in that conversation. We went live during the height of the pandemic, and that has been, in many ways, allowed us to imagine a kind of live series on justice, dissent, and this year on futures. Futures, our guiding thematic for this year, builds on previous conversations to summon places of possibility, refusal, and yes, as I always say, surrender. Now, as many of you may recall, Indra Kumar Meghwal, a 9-year-old student of Saraswati Vidya Mandir in Surana village, Jhalore district, Rajasthan, was beaten by his teacher for touching a drinking pot ostensibly reserved for students of the upper castes on July 20th of this year. He succumbed tragically to his injuries in hospital and later died on August 14th. While that event made headlines as a scene of spectacular caste violence and galvanized national debates, albeit for a brief news cycle, we know that such events are ordinary sites of humiliation and dehumanization for many Dalit Bahujan kin. The story of Meghwal, as wrenching as are many everyday scenes of gendered violence against Dalit girls and women that rarely make the news, so efficient and brutal is their occurrence. So given Tariq's interest in Rajasthan, today's event is dedicated to the efforts of Dalit feminists such as Suman Devatia, part of Dalit Women's Fight, who are working specifically to address issues of caste violence and gender segregation in the states of Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh, and to news platforms such as Khabar Lehriya and Mook Nayak, who are tirelessly recording in Hindi and occasionally in English and chronicle such occurrences. Such Dalit feminist platforms imagine futures of possibility, and we stand with them. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who will also be speaking of some such concerns in his current collaborative work. Dr. Tariq Thachil is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Advanced Study of India, and Madan Sobti, Professor of the Study of Contemporary India at the University of Pennsylvania. While I will wax eloquently about his incredible scholarship, I want to also give Tariq big props for the incredible work he's done at the center at Penn, my alma mater, which was not what it is right now. Let's just put it diplomatically. So Tariq's research focuses on political parties and political behavior, identity politics, urbanization, and migration, with a regional focus on India. His first book, which is a tremendous tour de force and won many, many awards, Elite Parties, Poor Voters, which was published in 2014, examines how elite parties use social services to galvanize mass support through a study of Hindu nationalism in India. His current project, which draws on extensive qualitative and quantitative research among poor migrants in Indian cities, which is a collaborative, will be part of a new book called Migrants and Machine Politics. And my understanding is that Tariq will share some of that work with us today. Now, before I have the pleasure of turning it over to Tariq, I just want to go over a few protocols. One is we chose for this to be a Zoom session so that it could be more interactive. So if you feel up to it, I urge you to leave your cameras on so that we can enjoy the pleasure of each other's company. The second is if you have a question for our speaker, we encourage questions, but please message me in chat and let me know that you'd like to ask a question, and I'll call on you at the end of the talk. And besides that, I think we're good to go. Oh, and a big shout out to Nelson Hutchinson, my wonderful grad comrade, who basically takes care of everything. And I owe him many cocktails because I have been remiss to thank him for all his efforts. All right, take it away, Tariq.
Thank you so much, Anjali. And thank you, especially Nelson. I know from working at a center now that staff really make everything go, and the people who are our comrades in many ways and supporters in actually organizing events are the people who allow for such events to happen. So Nelson, a special thanks to you, and Anjali, of course, thanks for inviting me to be part of this seminar series. What I'm going to do just quickly before I share my slides, just to note two things about what I'm going to be speaking on today. First, I'm actually not going to be talking about the book that you kindly mentioned. I'm taking your invitation to share a work in progress seriously and not share a work that's basically complete. So I'm actually going to be presenting some very, very new and still in formation work. And it's the first time I'm really presenting on it. So I look forward to feedback. It's still very much work that is taking shape. And the second thing is, bearing in mind is, I've been able to attend some of the fantastic seminars in this series. And bearing in mind the kind of interdisciplinary nature of the audience, I'm really going to focus on some of the kind of major motivations and initial broad insights that are coming out of this collaborative work. I'm not going to focus on many technical details or some of the more quantitative parts of the analysis, but I'm happy to if there are questions. And with that, let me share my screen and get started. Nelson, am I on the right screen? Yeah, great, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so the project that I'm going to present on today, taking the theme of futures for this webinar series, is on India's urban futures. Who governs in small towns? This is collaborative work with Adam Auerbach, my longtime co-author at American University, and Shikhar Singh, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And the three of us have worked, are part of a multi-year project on urban local governments in Rajasthan. And there's been already, a number of people who've helped us in different ways and collaborated on this project. I won't go through reading each of them, but the kind of collaborative work we do relies on many, many people chipping in. And so I want to make sure we duly acknowledge all of them before diving into the presentation. So thanks to you all. I know some of you are here in the Zoom. So what is the broadest motivation for what we're focusing on? And I think if we're thinking about futures in the most almost narrow literal sense, the future of the world is going to be urban. Between 1950 and 2050, the world is going to transform from 70% rural to 70% urban. This is the share of the world's population that lived in urban areas in 1950, with darker blue indicating more urban populations. You can see how that already changed by the year 2000. The world got bluer, and how it's expected to change by 2050, where basically almost all of the world is going to be majority urban. And almost all of this future population transformation from 2020 to 2050 is going to be in urban areas. So in fact, last year, and this is according to UN population estimates, last year was the year in which the world's rural population peaked. And it's actually set to decline by about 500 million people in the next 3 decades. So the number of people living in the countryside are going to go down. Almost all population growth is going to be in cities. Urban populations are expected to rise by 2 billion persons in the next 30 years. And about 90% of this growth is going to happen in 2 continents, Asia and Africa. And so India itself is projected to be the single biggest contributor to this global shift. So over the next 3 decades, India is set to add the combined population of the United States and France to its cities, about 415 million people, more than China and Nigeria, number 2 and 3 on the list combined. And the first decade of the 21st century is also the first in which India is going to has already added more people to its cities than to its villages. And so some of this urbanization and this trend in urbanization we're already seeing in India. And the question is, where is India going to urbanize? And here, at least, in working on urbanization for the past over a decade, I found that in India, popular narratives of urbanization tend to center on the image of migration of people to large cities. So this kind of prototypical pictures and photos of places like Bombay, this is what kind of gets passed around when we talk about India's urbanization. And in some ways, that's understandable, given the number and economic heft of these large cities in India. So India has 10 million plus mega cities and 50 million plus cities. By contrast, the US, for example, has only 10 million plus cities, including Philadelphia, where I'm speaking to you from today. So it maybe makes sense that we think so much about large cities and migration into these large cities when we think about urbanization in India, India's urban future. However, this narrative rests on kind of 2 myths regarding India's urbanization. The first myth is that migration is the biggest driver of natural population growth in India, of urban population growth in India. That's not true. Migration is not the biggest reason India is urbanizing. The biggest reason India is urbanizing is actually just the population growth of its cities itself. So the populations and people who are in cities, their own new births are actually the biggest component of urbanization in India. The second biggest component is actually the reclassification of rural spaces into urban spaces. And migration from the countryside is only the third contributor. Doesn't mean it's not important, but I think it's important to not see it as the primary reason that India is urbanizing. So just a kind of myth 1. Myth 2 is that most urban Indians live in million plus cities. Yes, there are 53 of them, but that's not true either. Recent and really important work by Tanu Kumar and Stenberg has shown that actually about 60% of India's urban population, about 3 in 5 urban Indians, live in towns even smaller than 1 million persons. So the majority of urban Indians actually live in smaller towns. And this is not unique to India. As you can see from this list, the same is true for many large low and middle income countries, places like Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, and Nigeria. And in some ways, this is only talking about towns with fewer than 1 million people. These towns are, in fact, very underrepresented in scholarship, both in the fields that we work in, Adam Shikhar and I, of urban political economy, but also in interdisciplinary urban studies research, which is a very fertile and rich area. But recent literature reviews have documented that they too severely underrepresent small towns, towns with fewer than 1 million people in their research. And again, I'm taking a pretty high threshold for what's a small town, towns with less than 1 million people. What about towns that are even smaller? And in India, 94% of our nearly 8,000 towns have fewer than not just 1 million, but 1 lakh or 100,000 people. more than 2 in 5 urban Indians live in these towns, about the same as the number that live in million-plus cities. And yet, at least in our kind of reading of the literature, we know very little about what's happening in these spaces. Of course, that doesn't mean we don't know anything, and especially outside of our core areas, there's been important research that we build on in focusing on small towns in India. There's been recent work on subaltern urbanization and non-metropolitan urban geographies, work on subaltern urbanism, which has more been focused on subaltern spaces within megacities, a little bit different. Unacknowledged urbanization, so recent work that's documented the rise of census towns in India, which are demographically urban but remain politically rural, i.e. governed by panchayats. A huge chunk of India's urban landscape are these census towns. And then work on things ranging from social change and gender employment, agricultural procurement, and interesting recent work that tries to document levels of caste-based segregation in cities of different sizes. All of this work has informed our interest, but we found that very few studies still examine the everyday workings of urban local governments in small towns. And if we're missing something, please do let us know, which we'd love to read and to be able to cite. But as political scientists, we're very interested in what's actually going on in the spaces that are actually responsible for governing small towns. And there's this kind of missing middle in a lot of scholarship in India, because following the decentralizing reforms of the 73rd Amendment to villages and 74th Amendment to urban local bodies, there's actually been a proliferation of studies of the workings of local governments in both panchayats and in large cities. But there's this missing middle about what's going on in small towns. And that's what drove us to conduct a multi-year project on Nagar Palikas in Rajasthan. Nagar Palikas are places that have less than 1 lakh people, distinguished from Nagar Parishads and Nagar Nigams that have larger populations. So we did fieldwork in places like Taranagar and Khandela, which have populations of even under 50,000 people. And we just, at this point, want to know some basic questions that we do not know convincing answers to, such as with regards to politics in these spaces. Who runs for office? Who wins? Who's in government? What do party organizations and campaigns in these spaces look like? With bureaucracy, who's actually staffing and running these municipal councils? How do bureaucrats and elected officials interact? Where does the locus of power lie? What kinds of citizens are heard? And with regard to finances, which is a crucial question for these spaces, how much money do these towns have? How much do they raise from their residents? What do they spend and not spend on? And if these questions seem very basic, I think in some ways they are, and they reflect our weak knowledge on even these basic questions. So the towns of Rajasthan look like this. These are all of Rajasthan's towns. The red dots are the big towns with over 1 lakh people. Those are not ones we're studying, 30 of them. Instead, our focus is these 155 towns with fewer than 1 lakh people. And in these towns, we conducted multi-pronged data collection. We've already been working on this for a few years. It was interrupted by the pandemic, but we've made field visits in 2018, 19, and 22 to 12 Nagar Palikas where we worked quite intensively, talking to people who are actually in the Palika office themselves, these elected officials, bureaucrats who are unelected and appointed, and then, of course, the staff who often are the people who are making things go in the Palika. We also collected small town budget data for all Rajasthan Nagar Palikas across a 12-year period to really get in the weeds of what's actually being spent and collected. And also collected data on elections in small towns across Rajasthan in the last local election. And then finally, we conducted a survey of over 2,000 Rajasthan elected officials, municipal councillors or parshads, and candidates for those elections across 60 towns, which we conducted in 2021. And I'm going to kind of dip into all of these different data sources in the rest of the talk and just provide you with a few glimpses of what we've learned. And again, we're still very much working through this. And I think most broadly, while very preliminary, our efforts are revealing significant challenges faced by these Nagar Palikas in dispensing their most basic duties, in providing even the most basic services for constituents. I don't think that itself is particularly surprising, but what was interesting to us is that these struggles often transcend conventional frameworks for debating decentralization to these governments in India. So often that debate takes the following form. There is a set of arguments that a lot of the dysfunction in local governments, especially in urban India, is because there's been insufficient decentralization of power to these towns, making them far weaker and less effective than even panchayats in rural areas. And the implication of these arguments is we need to significantly increase the devolution of power to local governments. A second argument is one of elite capture, that the reason these local governments fail is that decentralization essentially allows local elites, local dominant elites, often from privileged and oppressive class, to capture resources and basically the benefits of decentralization. And actually, the implication here is we might need greater oversight of local governments from higher level officials on the top or citizens from below. And I think the granular information we've been collecting is that while both of these views have merit to some degree, neither fully anticipates the forms of dysfunction and difficulty that Nagar Palikas are experiencing. And as just one example, collecting and spending money on local services and infrastructure are quite technical tasks. I think we don't always think about this fact that it's actually quite difficult to do. And elected officials who are being tasked with this, decentralization empowers them, but they often don't know how to perform these duties. And this is not a problem that will be addressed simply by just giving more power to Nagar Palikas or by more strictly monitoring them. It's a more fundamental problem that needs to be thought about. And the dysfunctions I'm talking about are readily apparent. I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of time in these places to be able to observe them. On our trips, you could witness frequent flooding due to inadequate sewage and drainage systems. And again, this is not even people who live in mega cities in India and even people who live in large cities like Chennai, Bangalore, or Delhi will say, these are problems that affect us as well. And that's true. But unlike in some of these bigger cities, 94% of towns in India do not have even a partial sewage network, which means that almost all urban sewage finds its ways to ponds, rivers, lakes without treatment. It's also true that the roads and road infrastructure in small towns is weaker than that of larger cities considerably. And this is both apparent in visiting these towns. It's also apparent from the census data that shows that small towns have weaker road networks than large cities. So that itself is not surprising, but the question is, of course, why? Why is there such low infrastructure and such poor infrastructure in these spaces? And most obviously, a problem is that these towns spend very little on the basic things that their citizens need. And just by point of comparison, the average annual spending on infrastructure per person in cities in China is about $362 a year, according to a 2017 study. In South Africa, that's over $500 per person per city per year. In India, that figure is $50 per person per year. And in Rajasthan's Nagar Palika, it doesn't even hit 30. So obviously, the question then becomes, why is there such low spending, even relative to other countries like South Africa that are not considerably wealthier than India? Well, often the answer that's given is the low spending is due to the inability of small towns in particular to raise revenue from their residents through taxes and user fees. Part of what happens with urbanization is local governments are expected to provide more services and more local infrastructure, and in return have to collect revenue from residents. And here we see small towns in India facing a particular problem. Let's look at the 6 largest municipal corporations in India, where again, a lot of energy in studying urbanization is devoted to. Well, these towns actually raise about 10,000 rupees per person per year, and about 60% of that comes from their own residents. So they get about 10,000 rupees per person per year, and 60% of that is raised from their own residents. In a city like Jaipur, that's one notch smaller, about 50% of Jaipur's budget is raised by their own residents. In the Nagar Palikas of Rajasthan, again, analyzing this budget data we had not previously seen, the figure is 7%. So compared to 60% in bigger cities, only 7% of Rajasthan's Nagar Palika's revenue comes from residents themselves. And the amount that's raised is pitifully small, 2,500 rupees per person per year. Very few towns are able to raise even more than 20% of their revenue from residents. And this, I think, clearly underscores a problem of inadequate resources that these towns have. So, okay, now that's the next question. Once we discovered this, why are Nagar Palikas unable to raise funds from their constituents? Why are small towns uniquely poor at doing this, even relative to bigger cities? And again, a common answer is the center and especially state governments have not devolved sufficient powers to local governments. And this is a problem in India in general that's been called asymmetric federalism, that the center and the central government is too dominant over the states. And that's where a lot of the debate has been, especially recently in the past 7 years. But what that sometimes elides is that both center and state very much are dominant over the local. And so This has made local governments financially and thus politically dependent on state and central governments. And that's only getting worse with centralizing trends under the past two governments since 2014, since the Modi government came to power. And this is a problem that's been widely acknowledged by the actors we spoke to. So one leading bureaucrat of one of the towns we went to said, look, municipalities are supposed to be self-financing institutions. Khud kamao or khud khao, tax se revenue lo or revenue se chalao. Essentially, you have to earn what you use, get revenue from taxes to run your local government. But we in the Nagar Palika are made solely dependent on the state government grants. And the reason is that our revenue sources are limited or taken away by the state government. And he references an important local tax that used to be collected by towns, octroi, a point of entry tax, that was taken away by the Rajasthan state government many years ago, as a huge loss to the municipality. And this is also backed up with the budget data that we saw that essentially shows an increasing share of town budgets come from central and state government grants, and a flat or declining share of town budgets come from town residents. So not only is this a problem, but it's a problem that's getting worse over time. And you can see again, since 2014 has been getting worse. These towns are more and more reliant on grants from center and state. And so that, I think, is clearly a problem. But this problem of inadequate decentralization cannot explain alone what's going wrong in Nagar Palikas. For example, it can't explain why these bodies struggle even in areas where they are empowered. So they're not able to collect revenues even where they are empowered to do so. A really important example of this is Bhumi and house tax, which rarely crosses 1% of overall revenue these towns raise, and is something they are in fact empowered to collect. And so more decentralization is not a sufficient remedy for this dysfunction. And higher level state officials often say, offer a different diagnosis of what the problem in Rajasthan is. And this came from the Rajasthan State Finance Commission's own report, which basically said, look, the situation of revenue collection is simply pathetic in all municipalities. That we agree. But why is that happening? Because towns should impose existing taxes, levy new taxes, and charge residents user fees for things like water and waste disposal. Okay, so why don't they? Well, the State Finance Commission concludes that towns suffer from corruption, vested interests, always a dreaded word in India, lack of courage, and of willingness to work hard. And again, you can very easily find evidence of quote unquote vested interests in Nagar Palikas. For example, in local contracting, an example of a local contract tender is on the right. And we interviewed junior engineers. The junior engineer is a crucial figure because he is the person who actually makes the estimates of any local work that has to be done. Any infrastructure project requires his estimate on the basis of which contractors bid. And this junior engineer, they're called JNs or gens. I am the JN here, and there is a dabang, a strongman contractor in the region. This contractor will do the work of 1 rupee and will try to snatch profits of 100 rupees. They, the contractors, would have criminal antecedents and even cases of murder. In fact, the junior engineer before me was almost killed at the Palika office. The contractor whose payment he had stopped was a local dabang. He came to the Palika office and fired at the junior engineer, but luckily the bullet did not hit him. Now, while that is lucky indeed, I think the problem is that if such incidents indeed dominate patterns of local spending, what we should see is a world in which Rajasthan's towns are spending a lot of money, 100 rupees of spending, but have little to show for it, 1 rupee of work. Do town budgets actually show this? So this is a diagnosis that's offered a lot in policy circles, but is there actual evidence that suggests this is the major problem? What we find is no. Actually, what's happening in Rajasthan's towns is that these towns are having severe problems of underspending. They're not actually being able to spend the money they're receiving, even though the money that they get is not very much. So I won't take you into the forensics of this, but if you look at Rajasthan budgets and town budgets, this is just a particular example, you can see that in this town, they start off with a surplus of 600 lakh rupees. This means already before the year even starts, they've been underspending by 600 lakhs, and that money is carried forward into their account. In that year, they receive about 1900 lakhs of rupees for spending, but they're only able to spend about 500 lakhs. So by the end of the year, the surplus that they have has almost doubled to almost 1400 lakh rupees, or 14 crores. And so the other second point is the underspending, the source is almost always on capital, which means infrastructure spending. So the place where spending is not happening is especially on infrastructure, not on revenue, which is typically to go for salaries. And I think this is a problem we saw occur across our whole sample. 92% of the towns in our sample, of all towns in Rajasthan, do not spend their full budget across the 12 years for which we have budget data. And the average town underspent by over 6 crores across this dozen years. This is significant. This is meaning that about half of the towns in our sample do not spend between a quarter and half of their annual budget. They're underspending by over 1,000 rupees per person per year, which, given that the total they spend per person is only 2,500 rupees, it's a large degree of underspending. And this, I think, is a significant, and at least when we've been sharing it with people in Rajasthan, relatively unknown problem. What's going on in Nagar Palikas is a more nuanced story than is often assumed. There's clearly insufficient power that's being given to these local governments, as many people have argued. But these governments also appear to struggle to execute the few duties they are given. Simply granting them more powers will not necessarily solve that. There's also clearly corruption around land and contracting, but high levels of underspending reveal dysfunctions that go beyond that as well. Towns appear unable to spend the funds they are given by center and state for infrastructure, even though it's infrastructure they desperately need, and even though the overall money they get to spend is not very much. Finally, and perhaps most troublingly, many elected officials we spoke to appeared unaware of these core issues. So, in fact, 28% of those we surveyed thought underspending was an issue. Only 28%, even though over 90% of towns underspend. And so I think a focus and an obsession with how local governments are either constrained by center and state or corrupt elides a kind of fundamental question. Do elected officers in India's towns and in Rajasthan's Nagar Palikas specifically even know what to do once they get to office? And this requires a deeper understanding of who governs in these municipal councils, and that is strikingly absent. We really have no systematic surveys of small town elected officials or bureaucrats. And so to rectify this, plan to conduct a large-scale face-to-face survey of councillors. Unfortunately, this was right when COVID hit. So instead, we pivoted to a phone-based survey. Just to give you a sense of how we did this, there are no lists of phone numbers of all Rajasthan's elected councillors. So a colleague, Anirvan Chaudhary at Berkeley, provided us with affidavits that he had scraped from all candidates in the last municipal election in Rajasthan. This is what those candidate affidavits look like. We then digitized all affidavits, which included the name, the ward number, and the mobile phone number of these candidates to create a database of nearly 13,000 candidates, all winners and runners-up across urban Rajasthan in the last election. And this is what we used to conduct our survey. This list of numbers and names is what we used. And we were able to survey just over 2,000 respondents from across 60 towns, both people who won and people who came second. And we got a healthy response rate from both men and women. Women were about a third of our sample. And a core question on the survey, I mean, we did many things on the survey, but I'm just going to focus on one thing, which is how much do elected officials even know about what they're supposed to be doing? Do they have what we call procedural knowledge regarding how to raise money, make demands for their wards, initiate spending requests if towns are struggling to both collect money and spend it? These tasks often require quite specific and somewhat technical knowledge. And there's been really no prior effort to assess if local elected officials have any idea of how to do these things. So to measure their kind of procedural knowledge, we read government documents, and there are a variety of government documents that pertain to these duties, and identified very simple but critical pieces of procedural information from these documents. So for example, a training booklet that was developed for Rajasthan's elected officials by the state government says that it's very important for these officials to know about the 74th Constitutional Amendment, which established their councils and outlined the council's core responsibilities. It's the most important act for legislators to know. So do councillors actually know about the 74th Amendment? Well, in our survey, only 2% of surveyed officials knew which amendment decentralized power to urban local bodies. So basically, no, they don't. We also then asked, do councillors know about the official urban planning priorities for their town? Every town in Rajasthan, the state government actually develops a master plan which provides patterns for land use for these towns. And this is an example of one of those master plans that shows how land is being used up here to how it should be used and developed over the next 20 years. And the idea is that for these governments to actually function, they should make all plans in accordance with this master plan. That's all fine, but do people even know, do these councillors even know there is a master plan and what years it's applicable for? And here we found only 8% could correctly identify whether their town has a master plan and what years it's active for. And again, we were quite generous in allowing them some errors in which years they could mention. We then asked, do councillors even know that their council is supposed to be collecting mandatory tax from residents, particularly the house tax, which just shows you a house tax form that's supposed to be collected on residences of a certain size and both commercial and industrial properties. You're supposed to collect this urban development tax. And this is tightly linked to efforts to kind of register titles and pattas and deliver people their pattas, and then in return, they pay a house tax. But do councillors even know this is something they should be doing? About 4 in 10 did not know that their government is even supposed to collect house tax, let alone how they should go about doing that. So even at a very basic level, they're not aware. About half of them are not aware. We also then asked, do they know that their council can actually propose new taxes to enhance the revenue base of their town, things like a fire tax or a lighting tax? Do they know that they can charge residents user fees for key services like solid waste removal or drainage? Once again, we found roughly half do not know that their council can levy new taxes, and more than half do not know that their council is supposed to collect user fees for basic services. We then asked, under Rajasthan state law, you as part of the council have to approve spending over a certain spending limit. You also have to approve a budget by mid-February. You must meet at least 6 times a year. You have to implement taxes and service delivery through formal committees. That's at least supposed to be how these bodies function. Do councillors know about this? Only 23% knew when their approval was required on spending, so a key duty that they're supposed to conduct. Only 20% knew the number of times their council must meet in the year. Less than 10% knew the date their council must finalize their annual budget. And I think we found that almost no town had functional committees of any kind, even basic executive and finance committees. Most officials we spoke to didn't know they were supposed to exist. So I would say, even given our initial cynicism going into this exercise, these were fairly sobering results, especially given the very low bar of questions, very simple fact-based questions that didn't actually require very granular information. Overall, people performed very badly, especially pertaining to questions for how to spend, knowing how to spend. Only about 16% was the average score across 10 questions across 3 questions on spending. So this is a sobering result, but then the question is, does it really matter? Does such lack of knowledge actually constrain officials from performing their duties? And here, at least the suggested evidence we have so far is that yes, it does. Politicians with greater procedural knowledge on these questions that we ask also are more involved in budget making, are more able to obtain goods and services for their ward. And so, in some ways, it's not just an academic interest, but actually informs how effective these local representatives can be for their constituents. And this was brought home to us not just in the survey data, but in conversation with these parshads as well. So for example, this is what a parshad we spoke to, a councillor, sounded like, who had very low levels of procedural knowledge. This councillor says, "Hum faltu hain, I'm useless. Whenever I go to ask for some work, they tell me there is no budget. It's been over a year, but nobody listens. They just tell us to wait for the budget to get works done, but we do not know when the budget is supposed to come. I do not even know what the budget of the Palika is. Nobody tells me the size of the budget. How do I complain about this? I do not know how to raise any points in front of the chairman and secretary. I do not have enough knowledge about any government schemes, my rights as a councillor." Contrast this with a ward councillor who actually did quite well in the top 5% in these kinds of knowledge questions. I won't read out the answer, but this person references several specific sources of both revenue and several specific sources of spending with which to kind of execute their duties and get things for people living in their ward. And this is something that bureaucrats themselves say. They say, look, the councillors don't only raise their complaints in person, they have to give us written complaints. An example is here on the right. And councillors who are more active and tell us about their problems will be able to get more work done. But many do not know much about these matters. There is no training per se. Most councillors know only about as much as the common man knows. And this is echoed by town residents, one of whom told us, my councillor, you will see that they get work done. She's got streetlights done in our ward. She's a capable parshad and knows what to say where. She objected to the bad material used in the road. She is educated, and only an educated person can get works done. And this last point that this resident makes speaks to a larger concern, which is a lack of knowledge or faltuness that may shape actually who governs in towns, not just who governs, but who actually governs in these spaces. What is the distribution of power within these elected councils? And I think this is a critical point, because if you just look at who is in Rajasthan's Nagar Palikas, there actually is some evidence of social diversity in terms of both who runs for and who wins office. So for example, in our sample, over a third were women, 23% were labeled as SC/ST candidates, Dalit or Adivasi candidates, 41% were OBC, and 24% were privileged caste or general caste Hindus. And this distribution overall is enabled by gender and caste-based quotas, which in local governments in India are far more extensive than at state and central levels. So in Rajasthan, about 60% of seats fall under some form of quota, again, far higher than at the state level. So only about 40 seats have no kind of quota with them. There are seats that are reserved just for women. There are seats that are reserved just for OBCs or SCs. And then there's seats that are reserved for specifically SC women or OBC women, etc. And so this also helps facilitate a lot of new entrants into politics, because some of these quotas rotate and eligibility requirements for different seats changes from election to election. We actually found that 70% of our sample had never contested elections before. And this is not just women, even the majority of men who were in our sample, both winners and runners-ups, had never contested elections before. And again, this is an even higher level than in places like Jaipur. It's facilitated by quotas, but there's something also about small towns, because in Jaipur, under the same quota system, about 50% of people were new first-timers. Another feature about who is governing in Rajasthan is that there's a high proportion of them who are not affiliated with any political party. So first of all, there's a fairly even balance between Congress and BJP. And that was also true with the distribution of who's in control of the overall council. But also this high proportion of people who are not affiliated with either major party, which is higher than, say, in Jaipur, where only 7% were independents. And so in some ways, small towns do not appear to be captured by an elite, experienced set of party insiders. There are many of them who are independents, many are first-timers, many are women, and many are from non-privileged caste backgrounds. And some of this may have to do with the fact that in small towns, party organizations and resources perhaps matter less. Many contests are highly personalized, in part because the wards that people are contesting for are tiny, on average about 1,000 people. By contrast, in Jaipur, the average ward is about 16,000 people. But one issue that reveals itself is when you think about who knows what, there are significant gaps. So if you look at who's in the council, it looks very diverse. But if you look at this basic knowledge of procedures, we find large gaps between men and women, more and less educated respondents, privileged castes and marginalized castes and Muslims. So privileged castes know more than both marginalized castes and Muslims, and those with and without prior experience of running. And gender, caste, and political experience are all top predictors of knowledge. And so what this means is inequities in knowledge may help enable control of seemingly diverse Nagar Palikas by a small handful of experienced and informed politicians, and entrench inequities along gender, experience, and educational privilege. So for example, Muslim women in our sample score 50% lower on knowledge questions than Hindu men. Less educated first-timers score 70% lower than educated, experienced candidates. So this can shape who runs the council and how, who actually governs. Of course, this is still very exploratory. There's much more work we need to do to assess this possibility, but it is something that's kind of emerging from our work and was kind of reinforced by field notes from what happened at the one meeting our team did observe, which was in March 2022, that even as meetings rarely happen for substantive matters, one was held to discuss a Kansmela in the town during a field visit. And many aspects of this meeting go against how such matters should be dealt with. So the chairman, a Brahmin, unilaterally increased the budget for the Mela from 15 to 20 lakh rupees without a discussion, saying it was a matter of pride and the budget was not a concern. And this was enabled by many parshads being unaware of what the chairman is and is not allowed to do. No woman spoke at this meeting. And there was actually a non-Mela issue that was brought up by an OBC counselor, but the chairman quickly noted it should be discussed privately outside of the meeting. And the meeting dispensed with the photo, with people putting on tilaks and taking a photo, as you can see below. So I think there's this real problem of the way in which knowledge and the inequities in knowledge may kind of entrench and reinforce inequities within the governing of these spaces. But in addition to that, overall, there are low levels of knowledge across all elected officials. So no subset of our sample, men, educated, experienced, advantaged caste, none of them cross over even 50% on our very crude overall index of knowledge. And to the degree that low knowledge informs local dysfunction, it can also help justify the continued insufficient devolution or even centralization of power that we're witnessing in India. The weaker local governments perform, the stronger the arguments perhaps can be made for centralizing power. So what might help? Let me just end this a kind of overall kind of a depressing diagnosis, but what might help? Well, one silver lining we found is that while only 5% of respondents said they received any kind of formal training or instruction, over 90% of our sample indicated they wanted training. And when we asked them kind of more specifically what they would like training about, actually over 70% specifically wanted training on how to put together a budget proposal for their ward. And on this issue particularly, Dalit and Muslim respondents expressed wanting this training even more than general caste respondents. And this might be indicative of the fact that they're aware of how they're being disadvantaged by a lack of knowledge, and they would like training to kind of remedy this. And I think at the same time, it's important to recognize that we're talking about how little they know about their existing duties at a time where more and more is being expected of these bodies. I mean, the recent discourse in India is about how they have to take on additional responsibilities with climate change, and that these urban local bodies are now going to have to develop and implement climate adaptation plans. And at least based on what we've been able to kind of work on, I've very limited faith that these towns are in any way equipped to either formulate or implement a climate adaptation plan, given that they currently don't know the limited duties that they are supposed to be doing. And so I think it's a moment where we really have to think about, this is a place, and these are towns that are poised to grow in both size and significance in India's demographic future. And what is the role that they will play in India's political future is a question that can only be answered with much more understanding of what's already happening in these spaces and not happening in these spaces. And again, we're still very much in the early days of this project, so it's far too soon for me to offer any conclusions, but I'm happy to discuss kind of future directions and possibilities for this work and take any questions that you may have. So thank you for listening, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Tariq. We are a robust group today, so if you all feel comfortable, if you could turn on your cameras, that would be great. So Tariq could actually have the pleasure of seeing everybody who's here. And of course, message me if you have questions. Tariq, I'm going to take my privilege as a moderator to ask you a question. Because I have been, thanks to your work and the work of many sort of feminists and urban planners, particularly in Western India and Maharashtra, where I'm more focused, this question of the 74th Amendment has been coming up quite a bit. So I think my question is, and I'm asking this from having learned from the work of someone like Amita Bhide, who writes about Maharashtra and is based at TIS. And one of the arguments, and again, this question is about something that you yourself spoke about, the uneven distribution of knowledge, which then leads to this kind of weird, underspending, which is a concept that I think everyone here should have been shocked to see, right? So one of the arguments Amita Bhide makes, which I'm sure you know, and many others make, is that part of the project of directed decentralization, which is what, I hear you saying, was that it assumes a kind of understanding of bureaucracy and knowledge that is standardized, even though states are trying to disarticulate them, and the center state and the local bodies. So I was sort of intrigued by your really fascinating evaluation of the asymmetries of knowledges, some of which were predictable, the caste, gender. But the idea of the knowledge as a form remained fairly stable. So I wanted to hear a little bit about I understand what you meant by, oh, more taxes, they could do more. But I think part of what I think folks who work on similar issues, again, I am not as aware of Northern India, are asking is a kind of, redrawing of what we understand to be vulnerability, right? So if we are moving from, what is it, the patterns of vulnerability, right? That you political scientists like to say. So anyway, it's a question that I had because in some ways I learned a lot from your research, but I was also seeing similarities and then trying to figure out, is this a story that can travel, or is this a particular regional story? So whatever you fancy.
No, these are excellent questions. I mean, I think I would say a couple of things. So one, we wanted to look, I think we've certainly, and Professor Bhire's work is, I think, actually very much resonant with some of what we're saying here, even if we're coming to it from slightly different disciplinary or methodological kind of perspectives, which is, I think that we have a lot of grand debates about decentralization in India. But what I found dissatisfying is that the act of local government is actually very boring, mundane, specific, and sometimes relies on that boring technicalities to sow seeds of dysfunction. So I think that, I rarely see pushes for actually training local councillors in just how to put a work order in. I haven't taken you through the steps of how a work order becomes a tender, but nothing can actually happen in these towns if somebody doesn't raise that demand. And if you don't know how to raise that demand, only your chairman does, then the council is going to spend in particular ways that you're going to be completely unaware of. And I think that just that simple point, and the fact that councillors we spoke to are themselves saying, the typical argument in India is that a lot of these people are apathetic or corrupt, right? But if a lot of them are saying we actually want some training and we have some specific ideas about what we want to be trained on, then just this kind of general diagnosis of apathy is a bit unsatisfying. Similarly, the calls from the state governments that we need to tax more. So we do ask those questions, but in some ways our findings kind of push back a little bit and say, the State Finance Commission says the problem is you're not raising enough revenues. But we're actually finding that even what they are getting, they're not able to spend. So before we push for collecting more taxes, there's some lower hanging fruit, which is why are they not even able to spend the money they're getting? It is a big problem if there are hundreds of lakhs of rupees going to these towns that is just sitting in a bank account, unable to be accessed. And that, I think, intersects with questions of vulnerability, because a lot of that underspending may be happening because particular councillors, and particularly councillors from disadvantaged backgrounds and vulnerable backgrounds, don't know how to spend money that might otherwise be allocated to their wards and their locations. So a lot of reservations on caste are based on demographic of the ward. So it's not just that if a SC or OBC politician doesn't know how to do it, it's bad for them, but the people and constituents they represent are also from those backgrounds. And so I think none of this needs to be, I think some of it is surprising. I think the underspending part is something that is not widely known. It's not surprising to me that there are inequities in this knowledge, but I think what we're trying to say is focusing on procedural knowledge as a way to understand how those inequities actually work in a technical, mundane, daily sense is maybe a new perspective on, because a lot of what we get told is actually local governments are the most representative bodies in India, right? Because the quotas are over the majority of seats. So if there's a space in which we have representative, diverse government, it's local bodies. They are close to their constituents. They are often from the same backgrounds as their constituents. Women are 1/3 of them. So these are the spaces that representationally should be flourishing. And what we are saying is, of course, in some ways that is profoundly true. It is true in terms of just who is in these offices. But here is a way to kind of reveal the way in which vulnerability works in these spaces in a way that's, I think, a little bit overshadowed in some of these kind of larger debates on decentralization in India. So, I mean, I think there's much to be said on each of those dimensions, but that's kind of my broad thought on kind of how we're thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting, Tariq, because I think, some of us who don't work in quantitative data, I think we don't understand the epistemic, similarities between the arguments we're making across. And I think that's where your observations are both, anticipated, but also unanticipated in so many interesting ways. We have a question, several questions. The first question is from Roshan Thomas, who unfortunately is unable to, I think because of internet, can't ask the question directly and asked me to speak on their behalf. So the question is, how often do we see the role of civil society in governing small and medium towns in India? I think that's a big question, but so whatever you fancy.
No, I think that, it's I can't speak to it in terms of, we didn't have concrete questions. We haven't surveyed citizens of these towns yet, which we definitely want to do to get a sense of several core questions about their experience of governments and also their experience of their elected and unelected officials. But one thing that I can say is that overall, the presence of powerful civil society bodies in these towns is much lower, again, than both mega cities, but even million-plus cities. So in some ways, the importance of the local government is almost enhanced in these spaces, because there are very few other avenues that citizens have for getting certain kinds of grievances heard, right? So there aren't lots of NGO offices in Khandela, which has 24,000 people. There aren't a lot of other ways to kind of access or pressure things that we saw routinely happen in Jaipur and Bhopal, where Adam and I've been working for many years, is that there are multiple ways to kind of pressure the local state, and even people who are living in informal squatter settlements avail of a variety of strategies to do so. There's a much thinner set of options for residents, even relatively advantaged residents in these small towns. And so I think in some ways, the Nagar Palika becomes an even more central site and gets kind of disproportionately important in kind of as being the kind of place where citizens go to. And so one thing I can say is that we asked councillors, how often citizens come to them with problems. And I think it was over 80% said that they got daily visits from people in their wards. Again, these are people who are in 1,000-person wards. So it's a very, very small neighborhood. And they're basically getting in constant touch. People are getting in constant touch with them with issues that they have. But the degree to which they're empowered to do very much about it is, I think, where the problem lies. And there, the role of civil society is, at least those kinds of organizations, what I take to be his question, is fairly limited.
Tariq, I just want you to say that I'm getting lots of comments from people who are listening on other platforms and not on Zoom, and saying that they are finally finding political theory and political science interesting when it comes to the study of South Asia. So I think we may have to thank you for that. But we do have other folks who have questions. Shataksi, I see you right there. Yeah, go please.
Hello, Dr. Thachil. Thank you so much for that very insightful talk. So I have two questions. One is, why did you choose Rajasthan as a case for your study? And second is, do you think the problem of women as proxy political candidates plays a part in this uneven knowledge distribution that you speak of?
Yeah, both excellent questions, Shatakshi. Thank you. So the first question is really one, and I think it's an important one to acknowledge in especially the kind of quantitative work that we're doing, is that a lot of the choices about where you study is based on kind of what you know and who you know. And so because Adam and I in particular have been working in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh for now, in Adam's case, 12 years, in my case, nearly a decade, we had been working and taking little short visits to these towns. And that, well before we started kind of officially researching this topic, because we've been thinking a lot about just patterns of urbanization in India. So we knew we were interested in this layer of small towns beyond. We'd moved to Jaipur because we thought too many people were studying, Delhi and Bombay and Bangalore and Chennai. And then even from Jaipur and Bhopal, we thought even this is kind of overrepresented. We need to go one level smaller. But if you want to actually collect, for example, all the budget data that we collected, that's not something you can just go somewhere and get. We've actually had to approach the Directorate of Local Bodies in Rajasthan, which was the body we were engaging with for our prior work. And it was only after interacting with them for over 5 years and repeated requests that we were able to actually obtain that information. The Election Commission information we were able to get before it was taken down. We've actually got several RTI applications pending to try and get data for previous elections. So we have to engage with the state as well. And often your best bet is having a local state government that you actually have some ties to. It also is true that it's a context we understand. It's a world in Rajasthan that we've now been working in and are familiar with. And we felt we needed some at least baseline contextual knowledge to be able to understand this relatively unexplored world for us. So that's that question. On women, of course, we were very attentive to this, especially not just in our kind of qualitative work, but also on our phone survey. We were very worried that our phone survey would be answered entirely by men. And so we actually did a couple of different things. And there is, the phenomenon of Chairman Pati, which I'm sure you're familiar of. I mean, the towns we went to, we had pictures of Chairman Pati with the, because the chairman was reserved to be a woman. And that's a wide scale problem. And there are many people who study that far more in depth than we have. But what we did do was actually note, because it was a phone, we actually asked female candidates if they could put speakerphone off and if they could talk to us privately. And if they couldn't, we wouldn't stop the interview, but we would note those things. And we actually found that the vast majority of them were able to put their speakerphone off, and the phone actually worked better than in person because they're able to get a degree of privacy on the phone that they are not able to get in in-person surveys. So we're still working through. I mean, there are many disadvantages to phone survey, but I was actually impressed. We also made notes of every single module and whether that module was one in which they received help or not. Now, we do actually find that when we the procedural knowledge questions I asked, if we actually note where women were helped and take out the women who were helped, the gap grows even bigger. So women who are giving their own answers without any help do even worse. So if anything, we're understating the degree of the gender gap in procedural information. I'm giving you the kind of conservative estimate of that. And of course, it's a problem. I will say, I find it kind of interesting to think about variation in that, because it's also now a kind of truism in India that, women who are elected through quotas are kind of proxies, but not all of them are, right? So one of the examples of a Parshad I quoted, who was very effective at the end, that's Hemlata. She's a female Parshad, and she was routinely noted by many of her residents as very effective. She was also the only one who came to a particular meeting without any kind of covering, and the only one who tried to speak at the meeting. So to me, what's also interesting is what makes Hemlata different from the other two female Parshads in the council, as much as just this general observation that women struggle with these forms of knowledge.
Shretakshi, thank you for that question. I had comments from people in chat. Before I turn it over to my colleague Nidhi Mahajan, who has a question, Tariq, I had several folks write in and say, if you could say something about how the binary of the urban and rural changes or stays static in these demographic understandings of urban and rural. This is from our other platforms. I'm trying to gather questions across. So if you could say something about that.
You want me to answer that first? Yeah.
And then we'll turn to Nidhi. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I had a whole slide which I took out on how we define the urban. And so let me say at the outset that India has a very high bar for when something makes it into the category of urban. So there's a threefold definition for something being urban in India. It has to have a population of over 5,000 people. It has to have a density of population of over 400 people per square kilometer. And it has to have over 75% of adult men employed outside of agriculture. So there's an employment criteria, a density criteria, and a population criteria. Most countries across the world use 2 or fewer criteria. So if India used the definition that Ghana uses, it would be like 60% urban. If it used the population criteria that Mexico uses, which is just 2,500 residents, it would be like 75% or 80% urban. There are good reasons why that's not the reason, and it has a lot to do with the kind of densely populated Gangetic plain villages that we have, and that that's done. The kind of definition of urban would be perhaps too capacious if we used other countries. But that is the outset. So when we say India's X% urban, it's based on that India-specific definition. The second area where I think this question is really important is the census towns that I spoke about. So we are focusing on towns that are governed as towns, what are called in India statutory towns. They are recognized as towns and governed by town urban local bodies and the 74th Amendment. There are many towns in India, in fact, almost 50%, and that's actually been the big growth in India's urban population, has come out of these spaces that have been reclassified by our census because they now meet the census criteria for being called urban, but they are not registered now as towns. And that is a political decision that it falls under the purview of state governments and actually varies hugely. There's been work on this by researchers at CPR and other places, because why is it that some states are very conservative and actually resist reclassification? Often that's a political story. There are often people who don't want to have their towns, their spaces reclassified as towns, precisely because certain benefits like Narega and many other welfare schemes will be taken away, and also new taxes will be imposed. So there is not just a demographic and technical story, but a political story in terms of what we consider the urban. We don't look at census towns because urban local bodies and Nagar Palikas don't govern census towns. Those are governed by panchayats, but they are fascinating in their own kind of object worthy of study. And if there are any students who are thinking of places to study, I think census towns from a variety of disciplinary perspectives are very understudied and very interesting spaces.
Yeah, no, I mean, on another topic, if we have chance, Tariq, when I have you to myself, I will ask you to think about Goa, which places a very difficult question because of the comunidades and different structures. But I know Nidhi, my colleague, has a question. Nidhi, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tariq. I'm learning a lot. Knowing nothing about how local governance works, I've learned a lot today. And I'm completely, like others have mentioned, completely shocked by the underspending due to a lack of knowledge, right? And I'm wondering, like, what are ways in which people are sort of sharing knowledge in sort of informal jugadu kinds of ways, right? Like people in some of these positions are really good at moving money around, right? So I'm also wondering, like, what are the ways in which some of that is playing out in this context, if at all? And I mean, yeah, that's really about the
info. No, so yeah, I think that's actually a really great question. I should say that more than any project I've ever worked on, I have been flummoxed by how difficult it is to get simple answers from people who should know and are directly responsible. So for example, and I don't think it's always because of subterfuge. It's often just a complete lack of understanding. So for example, we were very curious as we started discovering these surpluses. First of all, almost nobody in Jaipur knew about these surpluses. So then we were like, is it just that those funds can get siphoned off for private actors? Turns out that's actually not possible. And it's not that the chairman can just use that as a private slush fund, which would be a very simple explanation for underspending. That's really not what's going to happen. And also then we would see those accounts getting drawn down over time. And also it's clear, just if you look at the actual accounting of how those accounts work. But the other question you're asking about kind of jugadu knowledge sharing, I think that's an important one, one that that's one we want to study, is that, to what degree are different parshads helping each other out or even interested in helping each other out. One of the things that my hunch is that it's been working the opposite way, which is that really politics in these spaces is really captured by the chairman and works with the chief bureaucrat, the executive officer, to basically push their own agendas through. And a lot of that, which is I haven't shown you here, but a lot of what we found in interviews was that chairmans go into significant debt to buy elections, and the way they do that is by the same way elections everywhere in India, but even in these places, it's often multiple crore that is spent in order to purchase candidates to come to their party, cobble together their coalition, often independent candidates, and then they have to find ways of making that money back, and so they do it by kind of controlling the contracting process. And that's a very common story in India. So I don't think that's why I didn't share. I don't think it's particularly revelatory. What's interesting is even with those interests, cannot spend beyond a particular level. And some of that has to do with the fact that, and this is a separate area that I want to work on, is bureaucratic staffing of these towns is very, very low and very turnover prone. So that actually makes it hard. Even if I'm a chairman and I want to pass a bunch of stuff, if I don't have a junior engineer, there is nothing I can do because no estimate can be made. And junior engineers we talk to often want to move out of small towns because they don't like living there. They want to get transferred. Bureaucrats often get transferred if they hold up something and a politician gets upset with them, or they ask too many questions, as we know. So one of the towns we worked in had 27 EOs in the last 3 years. So every 2 months you're getting an EO transferring and trying to figure out trying to figure out what happens. And so that's another thing we want to try and document is the levels of those of turnover and to see if that's kind of driving some of these problems. So all of that makes this kind of knowledge sharing. I think even if you're trying to be jugadu, you need people in place and you need the people at the top to feel that there's some kind of political incentive to share knowledge. To do that. Again, it's very speculative. What I'm talking to you right now, we haven't studied those things, but those are the directions of my hunches.
No, thank you. That's super interesting. Can I ask a follow-up, actually?
Please, yeah.
This is really generative for me in terms of also thinking about, I'm thinking of Anastasia Piliavsky's work on patronage, right? And how that plays out in local contexts. And where, in this case, it's super interesting because if people are moving around like this, who are the political patrons locally, right? Like there's a complete sort of potentially an upending of that form of sort of local politics as patronage. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
don't know.
I think that there are two forms of turnover. There's bureaucratic turnover, and then, as I was showing you, there's electoral turnover, right? 70% of these candidates are first timers. So who's staying in these places? Who are the fixed nodes of governance? It could be these experienced politicians. And the second people who I haven't talked about at all are the staff, the clerks. So often these upper division, lower division clerks, they are the people who are lifers. They are the people who are somewhere for 20 years. They're from that town. They're not going anywhere. And very often they were the people we go to first when we go to Nagar Palikas to learn about what actually happens in these spaces, and where things are kept, where records are kept over time. And so I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. And also what happens is sometimes they are given the responsibility of higher offices because somebody has to fill that role. And if the position is still being filled, so our teams have found, I think, upper division, lower division clerks, sometimes even sanitation officers and computer officers serving as the chief person, as the EO, as additional charge, because there's nobody else to do that job. That's a really bewildering state of affairs. Especially when we think of the lack of government employment, the demand for government employment in India, to then think there are all these posts that are lying vacant is a big problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. Do you have the energy for 3 short questions before we call it?
Sure.
Okay, because I'm getting a lot of requests and I want to be mindful of your time as well.
No, I'm
because I know you've been very gracious to squeeze us in amongst your many activities today. So I have Shantanu Nevrekar next. Then we'll go with Pavitri Prasad, and then the last question to my wonderful colleague Madhavi Murthy. So Shantanu unfortunately can't turn on his video because of internet issues. So ask your question, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Arundekar. Hi, Tariq. I learned a lot from the talk, so thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask, I was actually very intrigued by the statistics you showed about the variations in how upper caste, dominant caste, and particularly men are able to show higher levels of access to this knowledge of procedural, everyday procedures of bureaucracy and of government as compared to others. And I wanted to know if you came across any informal associational kind of ways in which this knowledge is monopolized, in which this kind of knowledge is passed on amongst circles of largely dominant caste men. And is this purely something that comes from a lack of this knowledge being passed, being kind of propagated in formal seminars, which are supposed to be training opportunities, and in the absence of this, how is this knowledge gained by people who know this?
I think that's a great question, Shantanu, and it's an area that we don't have a lot to say yet, but it's an area we've been basically trying to think about, what are the ways in which political inequality expresses itself in these places, but not just as a kind of larger theoretical point, but like how is it actually in a day-to-day sense expressing itself? And I think knowledge of the form that we're talking about is clearly one, but far from the only dimension. And what the other one that we've been thinking a lot about is kinship and the degree to which we are seeing all this turnover, for example, but perhaps what's actually happening is that it's members of the same family who are, and we know that happens with gender, but even beyond gender, whether there are actually only a few families who are generating all these different candidates. So it's looking like there are lots of different candidates each time, but it's actually effectively constrained to a few families. And particularly the post of, say, chairman keeps rotating between the same few families. For that, quantitatively, we want to try and get this prior election commission data, which we don't have, and I can't really say without. But even we may be able to do something more with some of the other techniques that we use. Because my bet is that you're right, that especially in these small towns, we know economically there are often a few families who really hold the town kabza. And the degree to which that spills over into the political arena, we don't really know. But that kind of elite dominance, and that will almost certainly be along caste lines, But exactly what that looks like, we're still thinking through ways to measure. And I'd definitely love to hear any feedback you have on that, either on or offline. But I think it's a really important question, and it is something that I think is very likely. And the kind of interviews we've been doing do suggest. So, for example, at that Kansmela meeting that I talked about, only 3 men spoke, and 2 of them were brothers. And they were both Parshads, and it was very clear that they're also dominant. And the chairman was an Agarwal, and these 2 were Soni brothers who talked. And so I do think that that kind of network effect matters. And in the absence of training, and usually I'm not this big proponent of we must do a lot of training exercises to be, this is really the first time I've even thought about that. But the reason I have is because I do think there are some distillable pieces of info that would actually be very helpful. And right now, the only way you can access it is through access to one of these experienced elite few who don't have a lot of incentive to tell you how to do that, right? Even if you think of that meeting, they say do it outside the meeting. Why not in the meeting, right? And I don't think that's an accident, that we don't want to talk about it in the meeting. And so there's actually, you can't just increase the budget by 5 lakhs, right? You're not supposed to be able to do that, but there's no incentive to inform other people that you should actually be able to approve this. And so I think that's why I'm on this one thing, I actually feel like some basic, 10-point training, because the Rajasthan Municipal Act is 400 pages long. As one of the few people who's actually read it cover to cover, that, sitting that down in front of people and saying, read this, is not a solution. But some form of basic information dissemination, I actually think might be helpful.
Thank you, Tariq. Pavitra Prasad is next. Go ahead, Pavi.
Hi, thank you so much. Likewise, I'm a little bit flabbergasted actually at all this information that I've learned from your talk. So thank you for that. And I'm trying to wrap my head around how regional differences might affect the distribution of these knowledges and also how the processes work. I know this isn't a comparative study, but what is your impression of how the southern states handle the thank you.
I mean, I know it's a very good question. It's one where, I think why we've needed collaborative research, and we would probably need even more collaboration to be able to do this across multiple state governments. I do think it's really important, actually, because I don't know how much of this is a Rajasthan story and how much of this is a small towns of India story. Some of it I feel more confident about being a general problem. So the general levels of underspending the general levels of under-resourced, they don't have a lot of money to spend, is not just small towns in Rajasthan. We know from accounting data across Indian states, even southern states, that not a lot is spent in small towns when we look outside of India by really comparative standards. Even southern states don't do a great job. But what we don't know is, like, for example, this underspending problem. I only can say that about Rajasthan. I don't even know if that's true for Madhya Pradesh or UP. My bet is it'll be true for a lot of other North Indian states, but we may find something very different in Maharashtra. We might find something very different in West Bengal, where there are lots of other differences also with how urban local bodies function, with what is considered an urban local body. Kerala, like for many, Tamil Nadu. So I think that my prior hunch would be some of the bigger patterns, the inequities across gender, caste, but I can imagine replicating in every kind of setting. The general problem of being under-resourced and understudied, certainly, we can start with that we don't have great studies of small towns in Tamil Nadu or on these topics, not in general. And so those things are in common. But you're right. I think that I'm very cautious about saying that very specific things we're finding, this low procedural knowledge, because even what the procedures are vary state to state. It's like the 10-point index we can't just take it and apply everywhere, because the relevant knowledge will be in those states' municipal acts. But some kind of comparative exercise, I think, would be useful.
Thank you so much,
Tariq. I mean, I think the challenge, Pavi's question, and I think a lot of us are trying to figure out how this travels, is that you have an amendment that's national, and it's not about translation because it's a bureaucratic form. So I think that's the really kind of generative sticky ground, that we would love to traverse more. Before I turn it over to Madhavi, I think Jagan Shah has left our conversation, but wanted me to remind you about the role of the Finance Commission.
Yes.
And, just as a comment, and I just wanted to also make sure other folks heard that as well. Madhavi, please ask your question.
Thanks, Anjali. Thank you, Tariq, for this wonderful talk and sharing your work. It's also good to see you, even though it's on Zoom. So my question, actually, I mean, it's and thank you for, we're really close to being done to the end of the session. So thank you for engaging with us. My question is kind of maybe actually slightly related to Jagan Shah's comment on the, in chat, but I'm coming at it from, from a different perspective. I was wondering, could you tell us more about the form of bookkeeping, that you've encountered in this work? What is the state of the archives of these books? Like in what form are these budgets being maintained? And so is it possible to Jagan Shah's point, is it how do you track, can you track fudging of numbers, and right, can you track the money actually through via the form of the book, that are being maintained here?
No, I think that's it's definitely something that and this is related to Jagan Shah's point for those of you who don't see it, which is that, one of the kind of basic takeaway is, what if some of this money is not actually ever getting to the towns themselves, and it's getting stuck somewhere else? And, I should say that we're at this moment in India where we're in an era of centralization in every arena, both political centralization, financial centralization, with a lot of power being absorbed by the center, even vis-a-vis the state, let alone the local. But within that, I think what's been interesting is that the way that we access this data is that the towns have to generate these budgets themselves. They're required to annually report it, and then it's kept in a repository in the Directorate of Local Bodies in Rajasthan. And, what I think I have felt less worried about in going through this chain is that the money is not reaching the town. To Jagan Shah's point, I'm not saying that those problems never happen, but I think sometimes when you actually go to the town, the first people who would raise that issue are people in the towns themselves. They are not shy about saying that powers were taken away from them, that they are getting hosed by center and state. There are too many schemes now. There are central schemes that tie. They don't like all these imposition of central schemes because it's less decision and autonomy for them. If basically towns are just implementers of Swachh Bharat, for example, then they're saying, we may want to spend the money on something else, but we're told we have to spend it on this. We don't like that octroi was taken away. Give it to us. We don't want GST. We don't want to. So they aren't shy about saying when they are getting screwed by the center and state. And not once did we ever hear that this money that we're reporting, because we would show them their own budgets and say, we've got this from your Jaipur office. Does this match with what you reported? And every single time it matched. And also they said that, yeah, this is correct. This is how much money we got. Even the clerks would say, yeah, this is correct. This is how much money we got. Now, I haven't seen the actual bank khata. I'm not allowed to do that. But I think that, I've done enough work in town governments to feel that if there was something there, I would have heard it by now. If that was the problem, that may be also a problem, and it may be a problem elsewhere. I don't feel like that's the number one problem in this particular space. But again, I'm open to saying that it's a problem elsewhere. I'm not above the fact that what does happen is these towns just are no sense of how much money they're going to get year to year, because it's so determined for the top that the formula is not revealed very clearly to them. We've understood it a little bit, and it often tracks with, the money they receive is the money they're supposed to receive according to the formulas. But towns don't always know that. And so they're like, we're not sure next year. So how do we plan for multi-year projects? Which may be another reason for underspending, which is that we don't always know like how much money we're going to get. So there are ways in which they are being circumscribed and hands are tied behind their back. But I don't think the number one problem is that they're not getting the paisa itself, and at least in this form.
Thank you so much, Tariq. We've run out of time, but I just want to put this out there before you go. There were lots of questions about what do we understand by infrastructure? What does it mean to think about infrastructure? Schools, sanitation. Is there a hierarchy around infrastructure? And it's a conversation that we can certainly have, when we bring you back in person, hopefully. But for now, I want to really thank you on behalf of everyone. There are lots of people who are not on Zoom, but have been listening, because I know how busy you are. And it's been really wonderful to have you here. And I look forward to many more collaborations, not just with you, but also with the work that all of our centers are doing on such pressing questions. And to everyone else, Jai Bhim, and I hope to see you all again at our future events. Thank you, Tariq, again.
Thank
very
you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a
Yeah.
privilege. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.